Welcome to the Write Better Fiction podcast, the show that helps you, write better fiction. I'm Shane Miller, urban fantasy author, writing coach, and story geek, and each week I'll be talking to industry experts about the writing craft, publishing, and the business of being an author. Enjoy the show. Hello, fictioneers, and welcome to episode 14 of the Write Better Fiction podcast. Today I'm chatting to mystery and thriller author Tom Fowler, all about how to write thrillers, so stay tuned for that. But first, it's time for Question of the Week. Last week's question from the episode on starting a new pen name with Sacha Black was, which writing craft books do you recommend and why? I didn't get any answers for this one, but K.S. Barton said, perfect timing, I'm in the midst of starting a new pen name. Well, in that case, I hope you found the episode with Sacha helpful. I also got a couple more answers on the question from Helen Scheuer's episode on how to write a series. That question was, what is your favourite book series of all time and why? Angela Haas said, The Chronicles of Narnia for me. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe was one of the first books I read where I truly disappeared into the world while I was reading. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader was my favourite book in the series, and once I finished The Last Battle, I wrote my first short story with a pen in a spiral-bound notebook. And Jennifer J. Coldwater said, my favourite series is The Magician's Trilogy by Lev Grossman. I read all three books at least 14 times, and the first in the series many more times than that. Before you judge me, think about how many times you've watched The Office. It is my comfort read, my safe space, the escape I often need. As George R.R. Martin said, The Magicians is to Harry Potter what a shot of Irish whiskey is to a glass of weak tea. I love that quote, and I love The Magicians too, Jennifer. That's one series I read straight through and couldn't put down. This week's question is, what's your favourite genre to read and why? Okay, it's time for my update from the writing chair. I've had some minor writing challenges recently, and I'm telling you this because I'm just coming out the other side of those challenges. But you might be struggling right now, and I want you to know that you're not alone. So what have my challenges been? The first thing is adjusting to life outside the day job. Now, I know I left my day job just about 6 months ago now, but I really wasn't expecting it to be such a shift. And what I found the most difficult is finding my new routine since I left in December. Don't get me wrong, I love the freedom of working in the writing industry, and I'm so happy to be out of corporate life. I never, ever want to go back if I can help it. But finding my routine has been tough. I feel like I'm finally getting there, though. It's taken a while, but things are starting to come together, which is great. And the other thing that has been challenging for me is the self-imposed pressure since leaving my day job. The pressure to get the next book right, because book sales make up a part of my income now, whereas they didn't before. For those who follow me on social media, you'll know I've got 3 series in mind that form part of an interconnected universe based around Greek mythology. And I've been flip-flopping back and forth on which one to write next. I was in this weird kind of analysis by paralysis phase where I was trying to decide which one would stand the best chance of hitting the market, but I was really stuck. If you know Clifton Strengths or you've done any work with Becca Syme's Better Faster Academy, I'm a number 2 deliberative, and I was stuck in a deliberative basement. So I was trying to make the best decision based on very limited data. But the deliberative days are over, I think. I had a great chat last week with last week's guest, Sacha Black. She asked me some fantastic questions about what I want from the book, what I want from my career going forward. And we spoke about the market and also talked about this self-imposed pressure. And I finally worked out what I'm doing. Long story short, I've now fully committed to writing the Magic Rising series next. And I finished the outline for the first book that I'm tentatively calling Witch Hunt today. I'll keep you posted on how things develop in the coming weeks, but there's no more changing my mind. I'm fully set on this course of action now, and it feels fantastic. I can't wait to start this project. If you want early access to episodes and exclusive access to the Fictioneer community on Discord, where you can participate in things like Question of the Week and weekly accountability, you can support the Write Better Fiction podcast on Patreon for just $5 a month. Support the show at patreon.com/writebetterfiction. When I reach 50 patrons, I'm going to start recording a monthly Q&A to answer your writerly questions. Okay, that's about it from me, so let's get into the interview with Tom. For those of you watching on YouTube this week, unfortunately, I had an issue with the video feed, so this is just the audio of the interview with Tom, but you'll still get a ton out of it. Hello and welcome to the Write Better Fiction podcast. Today, I'm joined by Tom Fowler. Tom Fowler was born and raised in Baltimore and still resides in Maryland. He is the author of the C.T. Ferguson mysteries and the John Tyler thrillers, both of which are set in his home city. At about age 7, polite young Tom, I don't believe that at all, wrote a murder mystery in which no one died. The story gave him the writing bug, however, and he's been putting pen to paper and fingers to keys ever since. When not working or writing, Tom enjoys spending time with his family and friends, reading, sports, movies, and writing brief bios in the third person. We all love doing that. Hi, Tom. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Shane. Thanks for having me.
You are so welcome. So I was wondering if we could kick off then by you telling us a bit about you and your writing journey.
Well, as you just read, it started when I was 7. And yes, in fact, I was a polite child. I may have grown out of that in the intervening years, but yeah, I did write a murder mystery in which no one dies. So you need scare quotes around both murder and mystery there. But, you know, I always loved stories, and I even when I was 7 or whatever, I tried to capture that. And they were always really short, like 1 page of like very slanted handwriting on like an 8.5 by 11 paper or whatever. But I've always tried to keep at it over the years. I've dabbled in various genres, including urban fantasy, for a while, and like in my college years and in my 20s. And now that I'm a little older than that, I started reading a lot of mysteries and thrillers and watching TV shows and movies in those genres as well, and really wanted to write something in those spaces. And I probably started in earnest in about 2010 with some short stories. My mysteries first, the C.T. Ferguson series. I wrote a bunch of short stories, really just to find his voice, because I knew I wanted them to be first person, as most mysteries are. And if you don't have the voice in a first person book, you don't have much, honestly. That's really what it was. Most of those stories were not very good, and almost none of them have been or will be published. Some of them have been the basis of, I've turned them into longer novels, but really it was just an exercise in discovering his voice and writing that kind of story. And I published my first book in the fall of 2017, so almost 6 years now.
Nice. And you have been writing books fairly quickly. Like I think 2020 you started your John Tyler series, right? And there's like 6 in that series now.
Yeah, 5 of them out now. The 6th is on pre-order for August. Yeah.
Right. Nice. So I'm going to ask you the next question then, and I'll preface this by saying that the thriller genre is always touted as like a plot-heavy genre, which it is, but like characters are less important. I don't agree, and I don't think you do either, but the protagonist in your thriller series, John Tyler, is a complex character, military background, a lot of depth. So can you share your process for developing such layered characters and why you think it's important to still have those layered characters in the thriller genre?
Well, I do agree with you that I think character is more important than plot. I mean, without character, you just have a little boring recap of things that happened. You do need both, though, because without plot, you just have characters moving through set pieces and saying meaningless lines. So you do have to have both. But, there's only, 12 original plots or however many people have worked out that is. So, I'm probably not the most detailed plotter in the world. So I think what really differentiates a lot of stories is the characters, because there's only so many, there's only so many plots. So there are going to be a lot of revenge stories out there, or a lot of, one guy against the cartel or whatever it is. So who is going through those story beats, I think, is really the differentiator. And when I started coming up with John Tyler, and this is not something that may work for everyone, I really defined him by what I didn't want. I do love the Jack Reacher series, but I didn't want a Jack Reacher clone. I think that's been done by Lee
Mhm.
Child and many imitators. So I wanted someone who was not like a big physical brute, but still capable, someone who still had that special operator background, but was a little older. Tyler's 50 in the first book, and is affected by the world around him and by what he has done and continues to do. He does have PTSD. That's clear in all of the books, that he's managing it. And, he's not just I got a Kirkus review for the third one that said that commented on that and said, it was cool that he was more than just about steely bravado, that he's, a character who has been through a lot and seen a lot, and that affects him. And that's the kind of character I wanted. Yes, he's still going to shoot people and he's going to win his share of the fights and all of that, but I wanted him to be kind of interesting and even a little vulnerable along the way, because I do think in any kind of crowded genre, the characters really, someone might have a cool plot twist and that's great for that particular book, but for a series in particular, I think character is really the differentiator there.
Yeah, I agree. And I've read, I read a lot of thrillers, and
Hmm.
I've read the Reacher series and like a lot of David Baldacci books, but I do get fucking bored with the like cardboard cutout
Yeah,
action man type hero. Like it has its place, don't get me wrong, but
it does. It
there's
does.
only so
I,
many iterations of that you can do,
yeah,
right?
yeah, and I've been reading Sarah Rosette's book on writing a series, and one of the
Hmm.
things that she talks about in open-ended series, meaning the series is not defined as being only X number of books. Like Jack Reacher is like 26 or whatever it is now. Um, that the protagonist does not have to be a dynamic character. He doesn't have to change much over time. That the villains are different every time, and the setting, especially in Reacher books, because he moves throughout the country and the world, the setting is different every time. And look at like I mean, the Daniel Craig movies changed this a little bit, but James Bond has been a pretty static character over the years.
Hmm.
He shoots people, he sleeps with women, he gets in a good quip every now and then, and he drinks a martini, and there you go. That's it. So, yeah, I think when you can have a character who is a little bit different enough, but still hits some of the expectations of the genre. Like if Tyler were just a wimp who went home and cried every night, nobody would care about the books, right?
Yeah.
He's still got to have the background and the skills and all of that. But yeah, you're right. I didn't want just a fucking cardboard cutout who just, shoots people and, moves on to the next crime scene. It's been done. And it can be done entertainingly, but I didn't want to do it.
Yeah. And I think that's fair enough. Like we've all read so many of those books already. Who needs another one, right?
Right.
So you've said or written that your novels feature plenty of action, a little humor, and a little heart, which I 100% agree with, having read your books.
Thanks.
How do you balance these elements in your writing to keep readers engaged? Because again, these things are not synonymous usually with thriller books.
Right. Well, I am writing thrillers, so I do try to keep the action number one. And Tyler is a very active hero, and I think in my mystery series, C.T. Ferguson is as well. Both in terms of the Little Heart, both of them have love interests. C.T. is actually married now in that series. A lot of my readers thought that would never happen. He did actually get married. Spoiler alert! It's at the end of book 12. Um, and Tyler has a love interest. He I shouldn't say gains, but he meets in the first book, and she recurs throughout. But the heart in the Tyler books really is the relationship with him and his daughter, and that's one of the big differentiators that I wanted from a character like Reacher who really has no ties to anyone, is I wanted him to have a real consistent tie, and everything else that he's done and continues to do, Tyler considers himself a dad before anything. The books generally open and close with the two of them in a scene together, to kind of drive that point home. And yeah, you do need a little humor every now and then. I mean, look at most books, you got to throw in a joke every now and
Yeah.
then. They do it in the movies too. Yeah, you can go too far. I think we've all read books or seen action movies where it's like, okay, that one didn't really land.
Yeah.
That was one too many fucking quips there. You
Yeah.
know, Marvel has done that recently, I think, in some of their movies.
Yes.
But yeah, you got to. you got to focus on what the genre expectation is. And in like military and action thrillers, yeah, people want a fast-moving plot with a lot of action. You can have a joke every now and then. I think Tyler's dry sense of humor works well there. You can have a little bit of heart. You can have a love interest. You can have like a father-daughter relationship. And I think all those things are important. I think, again, it's something that differentiates him a little bit as a character from maybe some of the other characters in the space.
Yeah, definitely. And when I read, it's Lexi, isn't it? The daughter's name. I've
Yeah.
got that right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So when I read those, that was one of the defining things that I thought, oh, that makes this character different because he's not just a lone wolf. He's got a daughter to care for. And that was a really
Right.
interesting
Yeah.
dynamic.
And she helps him in some cases because Tyler's not much of a guy for technology, and Lexi, as the first book opens, she's going into college, so she's at that right age to be technologically savvy,
Mm-hmm.
and she helps him a lot because she is good with the computer side of things that he's not, so she can do research for him. In the third book, she is threatened by the people he's investigating, and she has to do some action of her own. So she's not just a side character who's here to help him move the plot along and get kidnapped or something like that. She actually has her own storylines. Like in the fifth book, that recently came out, she's moving out. She's moving into her own apartment
Mm-hmm.
near college. So yeah, she progresses too.
Yeah. And that's great to have some side character progression as well, because again, it can be really easy to slip
Hmm.
into a cardboard side character, just like it can with a protagonist.
Right.
Yeah. Great. So what, because we all know how important like suspense and tension is in thrillers. So what techniques do you employ to create suspense and keep readers on the edge of their seats throughout your books?
So the big one, and this is by far easier to do when you write in the third person, is to have the character land in the soup at the end of a chapter, and at the start of the next chapter, you cut away to somebody else doing something completely different. If Tyler has landed himself in a bad spot, the next chapter opens with Lexi doing something, or with something happening at Tyler's car repair shop, or anything to keep people saying, "No, I want to. What happened? There were three guys with guns coming up on him. What happened?" It's a little harder in the mystery series because that is first person, so
Yeah.
everything is in the main character's point of view. So if he lands himself in the shit at the end of one chapter, he's still there at the start of the next one, and he's got to get out of it. But you can also quick sentences in action scenes really convey a sense of fast pace. Shorter scenes, shorter chapters. I mean, if you look at some of James Patterson's books, there are 120, 130 chapters. It's
Yeah.
like 2 or 3 pages and done. We're on to the next one. And that's something I think my chapters have gotten shorter in my thrillers over time. Like The Mechanic was like 40 chapters, and Forced Induction, the most recent one, was like 53, because I've really tried to focus on only having no more than 2 scenes per chapter just to keep that pacing up. The word count is the same. Like none of that's effective, but I want the story beats to feel like they're happening faster. So I think if you don't have longer chapters, if you keep your sentences short during action scenes and things like that, don't have a lot of descriptions, or nobody cares what the trees look like during a fist fight. Just
Yeah.
have the characters duke it out and get on to the next thing. Um, and yeah, if you can, especially if you're writing in the third person, build that tension by putting a character in a bad spot and then not resolving it right away. If you can even go a whole chapter without resolving it, that's great because someone's going to keep reading because they're going to want to find out how the hero or heroine gets out of the bad spot you put them in.
Yeah, that's really great advice. And you brought up an interesting point there about the differences perhaps between writing in first person, third person, and also pacing. So I hadn't prepped you for this, but when you're writing your mysteries compared to
Mhm.
writing your thrillers, does pacing differ? And if so, how?
I don't think so. The chapter count is usually a little shorter, but it's all. I think maybe the thrillers are a little faster paced, which is not to say the mysteries are slow. I just think I focus very much on pacing
Yeah.
in the thrillers, and in the mysteries, yeah, pacing is a focus, but it's also the investigation and the crime, and have I provided enough clues, and have I misdirected the reader to make them think it's the killer is person X instead of person Y. So there are other considerations there, and first being in first person does complicate some of those things I talked about that I can do in the thrillers. Now, in the most recent mystery book, Concrete Angels, CT has recently gotten a secretary, TJ, so I gave her a few chapters in her point of view. Um, I didn't head hop. You know, if she had the point of view for the chapter, she kept it for the whole chapter. It was very clear early on that it was her point of view, and the next chapter was very clear early on we were back to CT's point of view. I've read that done badly in books. I was
Yeah.
really leery of doing it because people would mix it in the same chapter. I think if you're going to break your first person POV, you have to like isolate it into a chapter by itself. And I know that really wasn't your question. I've kind of gone off on a tangent here. Um, but it's all about writing better fiction, right? Don't mix
Yeah.
up POVs in the same chapter. There you go. So yeah, pacing is a consideration for the mysteries, yes, but there are other factors that I have to pay attention to as well.
Yeah, definitely. That I know you went off on a tangent there about POVs, but that's actually an important point as well because that can screw with um, pacing in a way, but also like the reader's experience of the fictive dream or whatever you want to call it. That can be something that really jars them out if you get that wrong. I had to do the same
Yeah,
thing in my urban fantasy books because they're first person. But if you get
right.
that wrong and you jar them out, that could lose them for the whole book, right?
Yeah, it can. The big gain of first person, I think it's something big in mysteries because readers like to guess along or play along, if you will, with the main character and try to figure things out. So when we see what the main character sees and hears and experiences, the readers get those clues. So even if it's something the main character kind of mentions but doesn't focus on, not misses, but doesn't really process, the reader can see that and think, oh, maybe that's important.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a red herring, maybe it's an actual clue. That's for them to figure out later in the book. But the limitation of first person is you can't really have things happen when the main character is not there, at least not described in detail when the main character is not there. It also makes developing secondary characters hard.
Mm-hmm.
CT's started off as his girlfriend, eventual wife, Gloria. I gave her her own storylines because I didn't want her just to be his fucking arm candy for however many books. I wanted her to have her own things to do, but that's difficult because we only see her through her interactions with him. She's only in the scene when he is. Um, so yeah, first person is great for certain things. It's limiting in other factors. And thirdly, there's no perfect point of view. Third person has its own pluses and minuses too. But I think if you need to have things happen when your main character is not there in a first person book, or you want to get a different character's POV, you can do it, but in a limited fashion. I think TJ maybe gets 5 or 6 chapters out of about 30. And it's clear in the chapters that we're in her headspace and that we move on back into CTs at the end of the chapter. So as long as you kind of firewall it off like that, I think you can do something like that well. And that can even enhance the storytelling because now things can happen when the main character is not present.
Yeah, and then you can reveal things that they don't know, but the reader knows,
Right.
makes them feel smart, all that good
Yes,
stuff.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Great. So we've spoken about tension. Move on to conflict, the actual bad stuff happening. How do you ensure that the conflicts and threats in your stories feel real and full of high stakes without, and what I'm referring to here, I think, is melodrama, because that's an issue that some thrillers have too.
Yeah, I try to base them on plausible scenarios. In the first book, it's some of Tyler's old crew who are causing problems, not just for him but for other people as well. And we have a cartel in the second book expanding into Maryland. We have traffickers in the third book. These are real world problems.
Mm-hmm.
This is not somebody with like I do enjoy the James Bond movies, but this is not someone who has like the magical ray that evaporates all the water in the
Yeah.
world or something absurd like that. I wanted to be grounded in reality. And the fourth book is a local politician who has a checkered past that he's trying to cover up. These things happen in the real world. So I think, is it ripped from the headlines? No, not really, but they're based on plausible scenarios that can and do happen. So I think as long as you're starting with a realistic scenario, obviously you have to adapt it for your particular story world and your protagonist and things like that. But as long as you're starting with something real, that's really the first step. And then the stakes have to be, yes, Tyler has to be threatened, or your main character has to be threatened. Other people around them, not just the people they know, but people they interact with in the story, have to be threatened or under suspicion. Bad things have to happen, even to some good people along the way. So you have to constantly keep that happening, but it all has to be in the service of your plot and realistic at the same time. if all of that makes sense. That was a bit of a rambly answer.
No,
I tend
no,
to do
that
that.
yeah, no, that does make sense because you could you could have a lot of conflict scenes in your book that have nothing to do with the plot. In
Right.
which case, why are they there? Because yeah, there might be a car chase or whatever, but if it's not relevant to what's going on, who cares, right?
Right. Yeah. It all has to be in service to the plot. It has to move the story forward, whether it's a car chase or whether it's, two characters sitting down and drinking coffee and talking. It
Hmm.
has to move the story forward, whatever it is.
Yeah, completely agree. We've mentioned Baltimore a couple of times, and it is obviously a recurring setting in your books. There we go. So, how do you use that setting to enhance the atmosphere and tension in your stories, given that you know it really well?
It's interesting. Yeah, Baltimore does feature prominently in my stories. Probably a little bit more in the mysteries. I've taken Tyler outside of Baltimore
Hmm.
and Maryland, I think more than C.T. Ferguson has been. And I'll get emails from people, not just people who lived in Baltimore, but like, oh, I came there for, I was there 2 weeks for a conference 10 years ago, and I ate at that restaurant you talked about. So when it's really cool when people can do world building and make up their own with fantasy worlds, or here's the wizard's version of London or whatever. That's all very cool. But when you can ground your book in reality and streets people have driven, restaurants they've been to, attractions they've seen, they'll feel, if they've been there, they'll like, oh, I've been on that street. I know where that is. I know where that park is. And I think that's a great experience for people. Even if you've never been to Baltimore, I'd like to think I describe things well enough that you can kind of picture it if you've never been. But as much as everyone thinks their home city is unique, if you've seen a row house, you've probably seen a row house. Yeah, I think the Baltimore ones are kind of cool, but that's not to say they don't do something very similar in other cities. So even if you've never been to Baltimore, you've probably driven one-way streets. You've seen connected houses, things like that. So it's easy to relate to, even if you've never specifically seen that thing yourself. So I think setting it there really helps people feel like the story is anchored and grounded in a real place. And when the events that are happening are plausible and not fantastic, and if you're writing a fantastic genre, you want fantastic events. I'm writing realistic mysteries and thrillers, so I want plausible real world events. And in a very slightly fictionalized, yes, version of Baltimore, there are a few things I've made up. Um, the mob boss's restaurant, by the way, is not real. I don't, I didn't want to presume anyone that my books would become
Yes.
super popular or anything, but I didn't want to use like to name a real Little Italy restaurant, Sabatino's, that a lot of people know who've come to Baltimore. I didn't want them to say, well, we can't go to Sabatino's because the mob boss hangs out there. Probably not. So that's why I made one up.
Yeah.
Um, so if you're going to use places in a interesting fashion like that, maybe you want to make something up. But 99% of it is real Baltimore. And I think having that authenticity really helps, especially for people who have either lived there or even just driven through a few times.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'll find out whether you've described it well because I'm coming to Baltimore in October, so I'll
Oh,
let you know.
nice. Yeah, let me know. I'll have to like get a pint or something.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so your books involve complex themes. We've mentioned some drug cartels, gun running, PTSD was a key one, especially in the Tyler series. So, can you discuss your research process and how you incorporate this knowledge into your storytelling?
So for the PTSD thing in particular, I read really an unrelated article. It was about therapeutic painting programs for people who have suffered traumatic brain injuries, and how that can kind of like retrain the brain to do some things it might have not forgotten, but not able to do as easily anymore because of the injury. So I was like, well, that's a very interesting sounding program. So I talked to a psychologist and I said, could this program be adapted in some way as a treatment for PT to help people manage PTSD? And she said, sure. So that's how that came to be. That's in the first book, in all the books really, Tyler does a little bit of painting to kind of just work through things in his head. And even sometimes within the space of a book, what he's working on will change as the events in the story change. Sometimes his painting gets a little darker. Sometimes it improves as things as events in the story unfold. So really, it's about you have to do research, and obviously everybody knows how to excuse me, how to Google, and now we can use Chat GPT to do some research for us, I'm sure. But some of it does involve like talking to professionals. I wouldn't want to presume that a therapeutic painting program could work as a potential way to manage PTSD. So I asked somebody who would know. So yeah, if you've reached the limits of your Googling and your Chat GPTing about something, ask somebody who's in that space every day, and they'll be able to tell you for sure.
Yeah, they will. And I think a lot of people are reluctant to do that because they think, oh, these
Yeah,
people won't want to talk to me because blah, blah, blah. But if you actually explain what you're doing, you'll find a lot of these experts will love to talk to you because it's their
yeah,
specialist field, right?
yeah. Especially if you tell them I want to get it right.
Yeah.
In my mystery series, one of the prominent side characters is CT's cousin, who starts out as a uniformed sergeant in the police department, eventually becomes a lieutenant. But I think after a baseball game, maybe during a baseball game, I talked to a Baltimore police officer about the police department and the structure of it and things like that. And I said, look, I'm writing these stories. Yes, the private investigator is the focus, but I don't want the police just to be buffoons who get everything wrong, and then the PI has to be the hero who comes in and figures it all out. Because there are books and stories like that. I think that's kind of ridiculous, honestly. Um, so when I told him, I was like, look, I want to get this right. Yes, I'm telling a story, so I'm going to probably fictionalize a few things, but I want to get it in broad strokes correct. He was very happy to talk to me and tell me things about the police department and things I didn't know and maybe couldn't look up easily. Um, Google doesn't tell you everything. So yeah, don't be afraid to reach out to somebody and ask them questions, because if it is their profession, they probably want you to do it right. And tell them you'll put a credit for them in the book and send them a copy when a paperback or whatever when it's done.
Yeah, that always works. That is a good
Yeah.
tip for sure. Again, I've not prepped you for this, but I've been thinking about it while we've been talking. And you mentioned like getting out of a chapter when you've put the character in hot water or whatever to pull the reader through to the next chapter. And that's a great technique for genres where you need that kind of high tension exit hook. What other tips do you have for hooking readers into a chapter and then leaving them wanting more at the end? Because the last thing we want, right, is for them to be up late reading and think, oh, I can put the book down now and go to fucking sleep.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like you want to have a good exit hook, you want to have a good opening hook. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, there's a gunfight or there's a car chase. It can just be like a clever line of dialogue or just something interesting that's happening. But I really started focusing on that with the thrillers in particular, because I do want to keep people reading. I want to keep people up past their bedtime. And when my ARC readers say, "Oh God, I read it in 2 nights because I couldn't put it down," it's like, well, mission accomplished. That's what I
Yeah.
wanted. So yeah, even if you're going to land somebody in the soup and not get them out of it right away, make sure that when you start the next chapter with the B plot or a side character or whatever, that something interesting is still happening. I can't put Tyler in the soup and then the next chapter starts with Lexi picking flowers. Nobody cares. That's
Yeah.
not going to work. Number one, she's probably not the type who would do that. But number two, nobody cares. That's not interesting. So yeah, start it with, something interesting happening to someone or a clever line of dialogue or something compelling from the B plot. Something that makes people want to turn the page. We both done the Fictionary program and they talk about
Mhm.
entry and exit hooks. And you really want to have a good opening to your chapter and a good ending to the chapter to keep people turning the pages or tapping the screen or whatever it is they're doing.
Yeah. And I guess that's similar advice to when a lot of new writers open their scenes with the whole day. Like they got up, they brushed their teeth,
Right.
they got
Yeah.
dressed. Like nobody gives a shit about that stuff.
Right. Or it was raining outside. So what? Unless the
Yeah.
rain matters, I don't care what the weather is, man. Tell me something cool.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so other than your characters, then, because we don't want you to be biased, who is your favorite thriller character of all time and why?
Um, I, I almost think we've been talking bad about these books, and I really don't want to give that impression. But I really like Jack Reacher.
Yeah,
Um, when I set out to write Tyler, yes, I described some non-Reacher attributes I wanted him to have, but Jack Reacher is a very cool and compelling character. I also like, for different reasons, Harry Bosch, who I would say is more of a mystery character than a thriller character. And if someone wanted to draw that distinction, that's fair. I think the Amazon series has shown a lot of people the character who may not have read Michael Connelly's books, which
yeah,
are all very good, by the way. And that's really the needle I was trying to thread. Because when I sat down to make Tyler, when I was describing things like, negative attributes, if you will, that I wanted him to have, my thought was, well, what if Jack Reacher had a house, a job, and a teenage daughter? And the incredibly obvious answer is he wouldn't be Jack Reacher anymore, right? Because
yes.
Reacher is defined by his lack of attachments and lack of material things and all of that. But a character like that might be Harry Bosch. And I didn't tell anyone this. It's just, if you're making up characters, you might as well shoot the moon, right?
Yeah.
Going for Reacher and Bosch, that's shooting the moon with two big characters in the space. But I think it was with White Lines, but the second book, a couple of my readers said, "Wow, he's a lot like a cross between Jack Reacher and Harry Bosch." And I was like, "Yes, that's just what I was going for." So don't be afraid to shoot the moon when you're coming up with character comparisons, even if you're trying to define your character as separate from those characters in some ways. I did the same thing with C.T. Ferguson. I defined him. I didn't want him to be like the grizzled ex-cop because that's been done before.
Hmm.
And I Spencer books, but that's a very prominent character who has that attribute. There were a lot of TV shows at the time, like Monk and Psych, where the main character had a photographic memory. And I was like, hey, well, I don't want him to have a photographic memory either, because that I feel like that's been done. So, you kind of back into the character in some ways. I did come up with some things I wanted him to, both of the characters to have and to do. But in a crowded space like mystery, thriller, romance, fantasy, science fiction, you're kind of defining these characters against some of the real benchmarks of the genre. And you don't want a Reacher clone or pick a Frodo clone or whatever, or Harry Potter clone. So you have to define them in some ways by their differences to these characters that a lot of people are going to know. But yeah, I would say Jack Reacher and Harry Bosch probably. And the Reacher series on Amazon, the first season I thought was very good. Second
Mm.
season should be coming out soon.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good series. And
Mm-hmm.
for those who haven't read the Bosch books, highly recommend. The series is great too, but obviously
Mm-hmm.
you can dive a lot deeper with the books.
Yes.
And yeah, you said something interesting there about kind of mixing character types, because I guess what we don't want to do is lean too heavily into character stereotype or
Mm-hmm.
cliche.
Right.
Like the drunk detective who's also addicted to drugs and divorced and doesn't really take care
Mm-hmm.
of himself and all that stuff that we've seen a million times, right?
Right. Yes. And it's not to say you can't write that stuff effectively, but yeah, it has been done a lot. And there are some characters who fit those stereotypes who I enjoy reading or watching.
Hmm. Yeah,
But that's not what I wanted to write. I wanted to put like kind of a bit of a fresh spin on things. That's why like C.T. Ferguson doesn't have a law enforcement background. That's why John Tyler has a teenage daughter and PTSD. Do I hit other beats, I think, for characters and story in those spaces? Yes, I think I do. But I wanted the characters to be familiar but different, if you will.
yeah, and I think that's what a lot of readers are looking for. And this is in no way to disparage those characters, because,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, you can write some fantastic characters that do follow all those tropes, I guess, or stereotypes. But
Mm-hmm.
when you give readers like similar but different, that I tend to find that that's when they really enjoy your books, because they
Right.
are getting like a fresh experience, but it feels familiar.
Yeah. Yeah. Readers of any genre expect certain things going in. So if you can give them those things, that's great. You can give them those things with a slight little twist on it. I think that sets you apart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. Okay, this is the Write Better Fiction podcast. It's time for my favorite questions, so much so that I ask all my guests. So, Tom Fowler, why do you write fiction?
I'm going to use a line from Highlander the series and say, because the alternative would be unthinkable. I was a big fan of Highlander the series, by the way. That line was delivered by Mythos, who I think was the best character on the show. But no, because I've loved story for all this time, and I've had all these ideas of various genres. I've written so many stories and even several novels that just will never be published. God, it was on Sasha Black's podcast. You had Nick Thacker on a while ago.
Mhm.
They were talking about practice and how he was saying like the book you don't publish is the practice.
Yeah.
So yeah, I had a lot of practice with some very bad books. Um, some none of which I don't think will ever see the light of day, at least in their current form. But they might inspire future stories. I mentioned like even those dreadful C.T. Ferguson stories, the plots of some of them got expanded into full-length novels. So they kind of exist in that form. But yeah, I write fiction because I have a lot of ideas about plots and characters, and I gotta get that stuff down. And it's great that people read it, but I think I would do it even if they didn't, you know?
Yeah, I think I would too. Talking about, I wasn't going to ask you anything else, but talking about Sasha's interview with Nick there, you talked about practice and kind of like, I guess, finding your process too. So, and you do write quite
Mhm.
fast in terms of, a 5 book series since 2020, plus the stuff that you've released in your other series too. That's no mean feat. So I was wondering if you could talk about your process a bit, just like what does it look like from
Sure.
to get a book written?
Yeah, I will caveat this by saying that my process is not necessarily going to work for anyone
No,
else.
yes, definitely not.
Um, and if you walk into a room of 100 writers, you'll probably get 100 different processes. Started out as a pantser or a discovery writer, as people like Joanna Penn like to say.
Hmm.
And I wrote myself into a corner in my third mystery. And to get out of it, I follow the advice that's attributed to Raymond Chandler, and that is if you're ever unsure of what to do, have a man walk in with a gun. I literally had a man walk in with a gun. You can extend that metaphor to just challenge the protagonist and make them get out of a situation. I literally had a guy with a gun walk into the room. But I realized I can't keep doing this. I can't like at the 75% mark have a guy walk in with a gun every book. It's going to
Every
become
time, yeah.
yeah, it's going to become self-parody at some point. So I started outlining. And I read a terrific book by Libby Hawker called Take Off Your Pants, which is
That
a
is
great
fantastic.
title, a great title for a book about outlining, I got to
Yeah.
say. She really nailed that. And I've adapted the process a little bit over time, but I still use a lot of what I learned in that book. And I do come up with outlines, and they're not long. They're 3 or 4 pages maybe of generally just character ideas and notes and things like that. And I use the plotter software to kind of turn that into a chapter and scene story, which I then export to Scrivener. Could you do all that in Word? Sure.
Mhm.
Not exactly the same way, but yeah, you could. So if you use Word or Google Docs to write, you could do something very similar. And really the outline is just to like a roadmap. Like, I live near DC. If I wanted to drive to California, I know I can get in my car and go west, right? Um, but that's all I know. I don't know the exact way to get to California from here. So that's why I have a roadmap. Now, if I want to, get off the road in Kansas City and check out a honky tonk bar, well, I'm going to do that. So the story takes a little bit of a detour, and I adjust the outline accordingly. So yeah, it's not set in stone. It's really just designed to keep me on the path, and the path can change a little bit, and that's fine. Um, but that's really my process. I tend to crank out first drafts 6 to 7 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, let's say, under 2 months usually. Exact time depends on the length of the book and everything else that's going on because I am a part-time writer.
Yeah.
So, I think working with my editor over the years, I write much cleaner first drafts than I used to because he has beaten a lot of things out of me over time. And I think I just produce cleaner copy now. So I usually, after I finish, I do kind of a self-editing pass, and I use Pro Writing Aid, and I'll make a few changes and tweaks here and there. But in general, um, the book doesn't change that much from when I finish to when I send it to him. Um, and then I publish it. I have a review team or an art team that gets it first. And I don't use a paid proofreader per se. My art team is very good at catching typos like that, because there's always going to be a few things that survive. No editor catches everything. There's always going to be a few little mistakes or wrong words that survive the process, and they're very good at finding those and pointing them out. So then, I set up pre-orders to keep me on time. That's something that my process, even post-COVID, my process has changed. And I now do longer pre-orders to make sure I have everything lined up and in place. And that may not work for anyone else. I know people who think outlining completely robs them of creativity. And look, if that's how you feel, listening to me probably isn't going to change your mind. But it's all about finding a process that works for you. There's a lot of trial and error, probably in equal measures when you're starting out, until you find that. But once you find it, stick with it.
Yeah, and that's a key point. A process is something you develop over time and still changes no matter how many books you write.
Right.
It's not, for newer writers that are listening to this, it's not something you're going to sit down on your first book and be like, yeah, that's how I'm going to write books going forward. It's probably not.
Yeah, I mean, my first book took me 6 years.
Yeah.
To get from the time I started writing it to the time I got it back from an editor. And that's not a sustainable pace. No. I can't write a long series with 6 years in between books.
Not really.
Right. So I've had to refine the process over time, but and it's changed several times, but it's what works for me. And the key is to find what works for you and stick to it. And if you got to change something because circumstances change, then do it. But in general, find a process that works for you and stick to it.
Great advice. And that's a great way to close out. So can you tell everyone a little bit more about you and everything that you do, where they can find you, all that good stuff?
Sure. My website is tomfowlerwrites.com, and my last name is Fowler. I also have tomfowlerbooks.com, which is where I sell direct. My books are available wide, so they're available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Google Play, Smashwords, all those places. Apple Books, pretty much everywhere. Audiobooks and paperbacks, same thing. So you can get them from Barnes and Noble. I'm usually not in bookstores per se, but you can go into Barnes and Noble and order a paperback from them in the store, and they're happy to do that. TomFowlerWrites.com is my website. I don't really blog much there, but there's a few things there, and then I sell direct on TomFowlerBooks.com.
Nice. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Tom. That was great.
Thanks, Shane. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed the episode with Tom and picked up a ton of actionable tips on how to write thrillers. Join me next week when I'll be hosting my first solo episode and talking all about the lessons I've learned from attending in-person conferences this year. Have a great writing week. Thanks for listening to the Write Better Fiction podcast. Remember to hit subscribe on your favorite podcatcher and leave a review, and we'll chat again next time.